Hello, thank you. Have you stopped beating your wife? Who really designed Castle Howard and Blenheim Palace? These are two very different questions. One is a notorious piece of logical trickery liable to reduce an unwary victim to an indignant state of perplexity. The other is a very serious question about British architectural history. Indeed, it's arguably the central question for Vanbrugh scholarship for almost as long as there's been Vanbrugh scholarship. As long ago as 1872, the great architectural encyclopedist Warwick Papworth published a short essay on Vanbrugh in Notes and Queries. He shrewdly observed that Nicholas Hawksmoor was a very clever draftsman and talented designer, capable of giving Vanbrugh all the assistance he might require. He finished, appropriately but pointedly, with a note and a query. I have never seen any drawings by Vanbrugh. Are there any known to be by him of any of his works? Just over 50 years later, Papworth's open question turned into open warfare. Henry Stuart Goodhart Rendell laid out an explosive case for Hawksmoor's essential contribution to Vanbrug's two great masterpieces, Castle Howard and Blenheim, in a slender volume in the Masters of Architecture series published by Ernest Benn. Then the Vanbrugh camp pushed back in the persons of Arthur T. Bolton, H. Avery Tipping, and Christopher Hussey. They held the field for nearly 30 years. However, the publication in 1954 of Lawrence Whistler's The Imagination of Vanbrugh and His Fellow Artists saw Hawksmoor once again regain the upper hand. His architectural reputation received a further boost a few years later when the late great Kerry Downes published the pioneering monograph on the architect that made both their reputations. Contrary to popular myth, however, Downes took a nuanced position on the authorship of Castle Howard and Blenheim. If they are undoubtedly early Vanbrugh, he wrote, they are surely also Vanbrugh under the guidance of Hawksmoor. It was a view from which he never really departed. And now, most recently, Vanbrugh's latest biographer, Charles Somerset Smith, has made another valiant rally on behalf of Vanbrugh. Hawksmoor may have assisted with the detailed supervision of works, the calculation of costs, and, extremely likely, some of the later adjustments to the design of Blenheim, he concedes. Ultimately, however, he was more like a project manager than a true collaborator. It is my aim today, as my unorthodox opening implied, to show that, as with unintended confessions of domestic cruelty, there is something wrong here, not so much with the statements themselves as with the questions that led to them. In both cases, we find our intuitions channeled towards two apparently mutually exclusive and exhaustive conclusions. In the first case, yes, I have stopped beating my wife, or no, I haven't stopped beating my wife. In the second, Vanbrugh or Hawksmoor. But as non-wife beaters know only too well, the two options certainly don't exhaust the possibilities. So the question we should surely be asking is not who really designed Castle Howard and Blenheim Palace, but how were Castle Howard and Blenheim Palace really designed? I'll be exploring this question today through surveying the surviving architectural drawings for each project in the order, as far as we can infer it, that they were produced. We can do this with a high degree of certainty by tracking the development of every design change they feature, large or small. The clarity of the patterns that emerge, I hope, will prove illuminating. First, Castle Howard. I was going to give a little tour around Castle Howard, but I don't think that's necessary as the basic layout of the site has been covered so well in previous talks, but in essence, a large central block flanked by wings to the north and the south, made very clear in the classic Vitruvius Britannicus plan here. There is a very early drawing for Castle Howard which shows the origins of this plan. We've already seen it before. Very similar in its basic layout to the final plan, but with the wings to the north very much more widely spaced. That creates a very different impression. So instead of having a deep, narrow courtyard, we have a relatively shallow, wide courtyard. And then the central block is connected to the two north wings by quadrant arcades. The layout is extremely original. There was nothing else quite like it in the British Isles at the time, but it's also really quite crude. Look particularly at the L-shaped arcades that turn into dwarf quadrants before joining the north wings. If you're used to classical norms, then eccentric will seem like an understatement. The drawing itself is, as far as I can see, neither by Vanbrugh nor Hawksmoor. We know, though, from documentary evidence that Vanbrugh claimed responsibility for something like this design from a very early point. We can infer, then, that the drawing was produced by a rather junior draftsman, almost certainly under Vanbrugh's direct supervision. There is an accompanying mezzanine plan, which appears to be by the same hand. But some notes on materials and the proposed location of the chapel are in Hawksmoor's handwriting. The drawing, in other words, appears to have passed from its originators to Hawksmoor in order to resolve various details. Then there is a dramatic change of mood. The next drawings are elevations of the north and south fronts. These are indisputably in Hawksmoor's hand. They match in proportions and fenestration the crude ground plans we've just been looking at, but they have transformed them into beautifully orchestrated and detailed pieces of classical design. And then the process starts over again with another ground plan. We're now much closer to the built design. The north wings have reached their final location, the quadrants more or less their built form. The building has also expanded to something like its executed dimensions. So the number of windows in the central block and the wings is getting to what we have in the existing structure. The plan is almost certainly in Vanbrugh's own hand and shows a firmer grasp of design than its direct predecessor, but it is still fairly crude in execution and detailing. It should be noted that the south wings in this drawing are pasted on replacements for lost originals, so we don't quite know how the drawing first appeared. But we do have an idea of what they probably looked like from another elevation drawing, once again, almost certainly in Hawksmoor's hand. Then comes another group of small-scale sketch plans, this time focusing on developing the south wing design, and this time accompanied by sketch elevations. These are demonstrably in Vanbrugh's hand. He has annotated them in his own highly distinctive handwriting, and their crudeness reflects their amateur authorship. Like the earliest ground plans, they are compositionally adventurous, but show a shaky grasp of classical detail and proportion. But remarkably, we can now see Vanbrugh actively making design decisions right in front of us. First, he introduces end pavilions to the south wings, and then, momentously, he places giant square columns inside the entrance hall. You can see there's just, if I point that there and there, these are big columns. So he's thinking in terms of for the first time, a giant entrance hall, the entrance hall we all know and love at Castle Howard. And then he goes on to sketch out the facade that shows both wings and the cupola towering above the central block. We're now very close to the final design. Again, we get another set of drawings that respond almost literally and precisely to this set of sketch drawings, and again, they're in the hand of Hawksmoor. Vanbrugh's somewhat simplistic forms and proportions have once again been transformed into compelling, assured classical compositions. We can now see the design almost as it was built. Now let's turn to Blenheim. Blenheim is a very similar house to Castle Howard in its basic disposition. The main difference is that the north and south wings have been joined together by the private apartments of the Duke and Duchess, which we see on the left-hand side, and a big gallery, which we see on the right-hand side. Another difference is that as part of the process of unifying the building, 4 big pavilions have been added to each corner. These then displace what was effectively the north wings of Castle Howard and push them forward, which are then linked to the main house by these colonnades on either side. So it's an evolution of the Castle Howard plan. The Blenheim drawings are unfortunately much more fragmentary than those for Castle Howard, but there's enough to get a similar impression of a process going on. The earliest plan that we have is by Henry Joines, who is the Clerk Comptroller of Works at Blenheim, and it is a very interesting plan indeed. As with the early Castle Howard plans, it maps out the basic form of the building in ways that are spatially and compositionally adventurous, but architectonically naive. Particularly odd features include the portico, which projects forward to an extreme degree. The central doorway of the gallery, here, is out of alignment with the central corridor, which is very strange. It loses what could have been one of the great vistas in the design. So there are odd things going on. Now, we can actually provide a rational explanation for these oddities. We know from other evidence that the original design for Blenheim didn't have 4 big corner pavilions. They were probably added around 2 to 3 months after the initial commission in late March or early April of 1705. Then, in June 1705, Vanbrugh wrote to his patron, the Duke of Marlborough, about another change. The hall is enlarged, he wrote, and a portico added, and yet the room much better lighted than before, i.e. through the addition of a clerestory. And the top of it rises above the rest of the building regularly in the middle of the 4 great pavilions. If we superimpose lines along the north and south fronts, these are the bold white lines in this slide, we can see that the axial line of the corridor lies exactly halfway between them. This suggests that when Vanbrugh added the pavilions, he did it in a distinctly slapdash way. He added their projection on the south side only, that is, on this side of the building, and in doing so, effectively stretched the gallery and the apartments from a fixed point on the north, bringing the centres out of displacement with the central axis. The result is the loss of the vista. And similarly, the extraordinary projection of the portico is needed to enable the central block of the hall to rise regularly between the 4 great pavilions, just the way Vanbrugh described. So you see if the dotted lines define the inside edges of the pavilions, and they line perfectly with the back wall of the hall and the front of the portico. So the set of ad hoc modifications that we see in these designs was subsequently refined, as we can see in this further plan. This is essentially the plan that was actually constructed. It is much more regular and architectonically competent, but still achieves the same basic compositional aims, which we can once again see through an overlay. I think we can be confident that it was Hawksmoor who reworked the basic idea in order to make it more regular and in order to make it essentially buildable. All the extant elevation drawings we have for Blenheim Palace are either by Hawksmoor in his own hand or were produced under his direct supervision. We have a drawing in his hand for the south front. It is carefully marked up with modifications. It was then handed over to the Blenheim surveyor, Henry Joines, to be redrawn with the changes incorporated. This lower design is essentially the design of Blenheim as it began to be constructed. So it was subsequently radically changed in 1706-7, but for a good 18 months, 2 years, this was the design that was being built. We have only Hawksmoor's drawing for the east front, but once again we can see markups, we can see little crosses indicating modifications, so we know that there would have been a second drawing produced probably to the same scale and by the same draftsman, Henry Joines, as the previous drawing for the south front. And then we have an inverse pattern of survival for the stable block, where we don't have Hawksmoor's design, but we do have Henry Joines's smaller scale copy. Once again, what we have is a clear pattern. We have a pattern of Vanbrugh mapping out a framework, boldly and rather crudely, before Hawksmoor transforms it into a highly compelling and assured classical composition. What we have then is a highly interdependent working relationship. Vanbrugh is definitely in charge. He has the clients. He is Hawksmoor's superior, both socially and in the hierarchies of their common employer, the Queen's Office of Works. But Vanbrugh's ideas, though adventurous, would have looked extremely amateurish had they been built just as they were. Hawksmoor translates, modifies, refines, adds projections and recessions, and all with fine detail. Vanbrugh, in other words, still depended completely on his nominal inferior to turn his concepts into the tightly integrated, aesthetically powerful designs we now admire and which still compel 300 years after they were built. And this, it should be remembered, is 6 years after the start of Vanbrugh's architectural career. Before I finish, though, I'd like to share 2 further drawings. I'm afraid I've kept something up my sleeve, because one is a drawing for Blenheim even earlier than the Vanbrugh and Joines plan that we saw at the beginning of the Blenheim sequence. It's not a conventional architectural drawing, but a landscape scheme. The house is sketched in as a tiny, tiny detail, in the hand of Hawksmoor, I should add. It conspicuously lacks the pavilions, which we've just heard about being added, and it lacks the portico. This is as close as the graphic evidence takes us to the very first designs for Blenheim. But more significant than the fact of the drawing itself is the remarkable resemblance it has to the drawing on the right. This is one of a series of unbuilt projects for the rebuilding of Hampton Court. Albeit with different proportions, we see all the same basic compositional elements as we see at Blenheim. A tall central block, this is Henry VIII's Great Hall recased, sitting over tightly inset quadrant colonnades, the little columns are marked in, connecting to flanking blocks, then long corridors or colonnades projecting forward, linking us to deep service blocks at the front of the courtyard. This too was drawn by Nicholas Hawksmoor in 1689, a full decade before Vanbrugh turned to architecture. These adventurous compositions were Hawksmoor's before they were Vanbrugh's. So, who really did design Castle Howard and Blenheim Palace? The answer is simple: Vanbrugh and Hawksmoor.